Aaron Slater had always been a man of precision and practicality. As a former engineer with a passion for building and designing, he approached every aspect of life with a meticulousness that others sometimes found overwhelming. After years of working in the demanding world of industrial design, Aaron decided to leave the chaos behind and settle into a quieter life. His choice of neighborhood reflected his desire for peace, a suburban street with tree-lined sidewalks and homes that exuded a comforting uniformity. He purchased a modest house at the end of the cul-de-sac, a property he saw as both a retreat and a project. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a canvas for his ideas. One of the first things Aaron tackled was the mailbox. To the average passerby, a mailbox might seem like an unremarkable detail, but to Aaron, it was a symbol of individuality and craftsmanship. Using reclaimed wood and weathered steel, he built a unique, sturdy structure that blended a rustic charm with modern practicality. It stood taller than most mailboxes on the street and featured subtle engravings that gave it character. It wasn't flashy or ostentatious, just a personal touch that represented the care he poured into his home. For Aaron, it was a small but satisfying piece of his larger vision for the property. From the moment the mailbox was installed, it caught the attention of his neighbor, Randall George. Randall was an older man with a gruff demeanor, the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's business and felt entitled to enforce unwritten rules about how things should be done on their street. Randall's house was the largest on the block, a sprawling structure with meticulously trimmed hedges and a driveway that gleamed from frequent power washes. He had lived there for over 3 decades, a self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood, and he made it his mission to ensure everything stayed just the way he liked it. It didn't take long for Randall to express his displeasure with Aaron's mailbox. On Aaron's second week in the neighborhood, Randall stopped by uninvited, his posture stiff with authority. "You know, that thing doesn't really fit with the rest of the street," he said, gesturing at the mailbox with a pointed finger. "Most of us stick to standard designs, keeps things looking uniform. You might want to think about replacing it." His tone carried an edge that suggested this was more than a friendly suggestion. Aaron, who had encountered plenty of rigid personalities in his engineering career, smiled politely and replied, "Thanks for the input, but I like it the way it is." Randall didn't press the issue further that day, but his disapproval lingered in the air. Over the following weeks, Aaron noticed the older man watching him from across the street, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Other neighbors seemed friendly enough, waving as they walked their dogs or tended to their lawns, but Randall's presence was a constant reminder that not everyone welcomed change. One morning, as Aaron left for a hardware store to pick up supplies for another project, he noticed something strange. The mailbox was slightly tilted, as if it had been struck by something. Kneeling down, he saw fresh scuff marks on the side and a faint dent on the metal base. At first, he dismissed it as an accident. Perhaps a delivery driver had misjudged their turn or a cyclist had clipped it. He straightened the mailbox, dusted it off, and moved on with his day. But the thought gnawed at him, could it have been deliberate? A week later, the situation escalated. Aaron woke up to find the mailbox knocked completely off its foundation, lying several feet away from where it had been. The base was cracked, and the wood was splintered beyond repair. Frustration bubbled up as Aaron surveyed the damage. This wasn't an accident, it was intentional. Someone had gone out of their way to destroy something he had carefully crafted, and he couldn't ignore the implications. His mind immediately went to Randall. The man's disdain for the mailbox had been clear, but would he really stoop to such petty vandalism? Aaron shook his head, unwilling to make accusations without evidence. Determined not to let this incident deter him, Aaron decided to rebuild the mailbox. This time he opted for a design that was not only aesthetically pleasing but nearly indestructible. Using reinforced steel and concrete, he constructed a new structure that could withstand almost anything short of a wrecking ball. It wasn't just about practicality anymore, it was a statement. If someone wanted to challenge him, they'd find he wasn't the type to back down easily. As Aaron installed the new mailbox, he felt a mixture of satisfaction and defiance. Neighbors slowed down as they drove past, some nodding in approval, others clearly curious about the reinforced design. Randall, however, made no effort to hide his irritation. He stood at the edge of his driveway, arms crossed as usual, muttering something under his breath as he stared at Aaron's handiwork. It was the kind of look that could curdle milk. The days passed uneventfully until, one night, Aaron was jolted awake by a loud noise outside. Heart pounding, he threw on a jacket and rushed to his front yard. The mailbox was still standing, but the scene around it told a different story. Skid marks marred the pavement nearby, and fragments of a car's headlight and bumper littered the ground. Aaron's reinforced design had done its job. It had not only withstood the impact but left the aggressor with a costly repair bill. He picked up a piece of shattered plastic and turned it over in his hand, noting the brand and model of the car it had come from. The realization hit him like a freight train. It matched Randall's truck. Aaron's instincts told him to confront Randall immediately, but he hesitated. Marching across the street in the middle of the night felt impulsive, and he preferred to approach situations with logic and careful planning. Instead, he returned inside, placing the headlight fragment on his kitchen counter as a reminder that this wasn't over. As he sat in the quiet of his home, Aaron began to strategize. If Randall was responsible, he would need more than circumstantial evidence to hold him accountable. This was no longer just about a mailbox, it was about standing his ground against someone who thought they could intimidate him into submission, and Aaron had no intention of losing. The days after the late-night incident were tense for Aaron. Every time he stepped out of his house, he felt Randall's presence looming across the street. The older man didn't hide his disdain either. He was always there sitting on his porch, pretending to read the paper or inspecting his hedge trimmers while throwing the occasional glare in Aaron's direction. Aaron had faced challenging personalities before in his career, but this was different. Randall's disdain wasn't professional rivalry or workplace politics, it felt personal, even territorial. Aaron didn't want to escalate the situation prematurely, but he couldn't shake the thought that Randall's truck might have been the one that slammed into his reinforced mailbox. The fragment of a headlight casing sitting on his kitchen counter taunted him as a silent clue. Yet he knew confronting Randall without undeniable proof would only make things worse. The man already seemed ready for an argument at a moment's notice, and Aaron had no intention of giving him the satisfaction. Determined to focus on practical solutions, Aaron decided to investigate more calmly. He visited the auto repair shop a few blocks from the neighborhood under the guise of needing advice about his own car. After a friendly chat with the mechanic about brake wear and engine maintenance, Aaron casually mentioned a damaged headlight he'd found near his property. "You ever seen something like this?" he asked, pulling out the broken piece he'd collected that night. The mechanic examined the fragment briefly, rubbing his grease-streaked hands on a rag. "Yeah, it looks like this came from an F-150. Pretty common truck around here. You think someone hit your car or something?" Aaron shook his head. "Not my car, my mailbox. Late night hit and run, I guess. You had any customers come in with headlight damage recently?" He kept his tone light, as though it was just small talk. The mechanic raised an eyebrow. "Well, if it's from an F-150, I'd say that narrows it down a bit. I can't say for sure, but I did have someone come in last week, asking about replacing a headlight and a cracked bumper. Older guy, lives around here. Didn't catch his name, though." Aaron didn't need the name, he already knew who the mechanic was talking about. Thanking him for his time, Aaron left the shop feeling more certain than ever that Randall was behind the attack. Still, knowing it and proving it were two very different things. He would need to approach this carefully. The next day, Aaron noticed something new. A bright yellow envelope was tucked into his mailbox, its garish color standing out sharply against the muted tones of the steel structure. Pulling it out, he realized it wasn't an advertisement or an ordinary piece of mail. Instead, it was an anonymous letter, hastily typed on cheap paper. "Your mailbox is a hazard. It's only a matter of time before someone gets seriously hurt. Do the right thing and take it down before there's another accident." Aaron read the note twice, his brow furrowing. There was no signature, no clear indication of who had sent it, but the message was clear: someone didn't like his mailbox, and they were willing to threaten him to get their way. He immediately suspected Randall. Who else would care so much about a simple structure on someone else's property? But again, he had no proof. The anonymous nature of the letter was calculated. It left no fingerprints, no trail, just an uneasy warning. Instead of reacting impulsively, Aaron decided to document everything. He took a photo of the letter and stored it with the evidence he'd already collected. If this situation ever escalated further, he would have a paper trail to back him up. It was a small but necessary step. That night, Aaron tried to relax, but the unease gnawed at him. Every creak in the house, every rustle of leaves outside his window, made him sit up and listen intently. He didn't want to admit it, but the situation was starting to affect him. For the first time since moving to the neighborhood, his sanctuary didn't feel like home. Then, 2 nights later, it happened again. Just after midnight, Aaron was jolted awake by the sound of screeching tires and a loud metallic clang. Heart racing, he jumped out of bed, grabbed his flashlight, and ran outside. The reinforced mailbox stood unscathed, its steel construction undamaged by whatever force had struck it. But the scene around it was telling. Skid marks marred the street, and more fragments of broken plastic and glass lay scattered across the pavement. Aaron scanned the area with his flashlight, but whoever had caused the damage was long gone. He crouched down to inspect the debris, picking up a piece of shattered tail light this time. The pattern on the red plastic was identical to the headlight fragment he'd found earlier. Once again, his suspicions zeroed in on Randall's truck. But what truly caught Aaron's attention was a fresh set of tire marks leading away from the scene. They matched the width and tread of Randall's truck, and the trail led directly to his driveway. The pieces were falling into place. As Aaron stood there, piecing everything together, he heard the faint sound of a door creaking open. Looking up, he saw the silhouette of Randall standing on his porch, his arms crossed and his posture confrontational. "You out here playing detective?" the older man called out, his voice laced with mockery. Aaron didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pocketed the tail light fragment and straightened up, meeting Randall's glare with calm resolve. "Late night for you, isn't it?" Randall added, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Aaron took a step closer, his tone measured but firm. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about these tire marks or the broken glass, would you?" Randall shrugged nonchalantly. "Not my problem if people around here don't know how to drive. Maybe you should think about putting that thing somewhere safer." Aaron clenched his jaw, suppressing the urge to escalate the situation. He knew what Randall was doing, trying to provoke him into a confrontation. Instead, he simply said, "I'll let the authorities decide what to do with the evidence." Randall's smirk faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "Suit yourself," he said, turning to go back inside. That was the moment Aaron realized the conflict was far from over. Randall wasn't just being petty, he was actively trying to assert dominance, to remind Aaron that he didn't belong in this neighborhood. It wasn't about the mailbox anymore, it was about control. Determined to protect his property and his peace of mind, Aaron decided it was time to escalate things on his own terms. The next morning, he called his lawyer, explaining the situation and sharing the evidence he had collected so far. The lawyer listened carefully, then advised Aaron to file a formal report with both the police and the local neighborhood committee. "The more documentation you have, the stronger your case will be," the lawyer said. Aaron agreed and spent the rest of the day compiling everything: the photos of the damage, the letter, the fragments of Randall's truck, and even a map of the tire marks leading from the mailbox to Randall's driveway. If Randall wanted a fight, Aaron was prepared to take it to the next level. What Randall didn't know, however, was that Aaron wasn't just going to react defensively anymore. He was going to play smart, using every tool at his disposal to ensure that this feud ended on his terms. The battle for the mailbox had become something bigger, a fight for respect and the right to live peacefully in his own home, and Aaron wasn't about to lose. Aaron's decision to escalate the situation in a measured, calculated way felt right, but it didn't make things any less tense. Over the following days, he filed a formal report with the police, carefully detailing the series of incidents, from the destruction of his original mailbox to the repeated attempts to damage the new one. He included photos of the broken fragments from Randall's truck, the yellow letter, and even the tire marks leading directly to his neighbor's driveway. The officer who took the report seemed sympathetic, but non-committal. "We'll look into it," she had said, her tone neutral. Aaron knew better than to rely solely on their follow-up. He would need to stay vigilant. Despite his calm exterior, Aaron couldn't ignore the feeling that he was being watched. Every time he stepped outside to check the mailbox or work on his yard, he felt Randall's eyes on him. Sometimes he caught the older man standing by his porch, pretending to sweep leaves or adjust his lawn chairs. Other times, Randall would drive by slowly, his truck deliberately idling as he passed Aaron's house, the sound of the engine almost taunting. It was psychological warfare, subtle enough to seem innocuous to an outsider but obvious to Aaron. One evening, as Aaron returned from a walk, he noticed something new. The reinforced mailbox, which had stood unshaken through the previous incidents, now had fresh scratches along one side. The metal was sturdy enough to resist dents, but the scratches were deep and deliberate, as though someone had taken a heavy tool to it. Aaron knelt to inspect the marks, his frustration mounting. Whoever had done this wasn't just attacking the mailbox anymore, they were trying to provoke him. That night, Aaron reviewed the evidence he had collected so far. It was clear that Randall wasn't going to stop, but what bothered Aaron more was the escalation in the neighbor's behavior. This wasn't just about a petty grudge over a mailbox, it was becoming a dangerous obsession. The scratched mailbox was proof that Randall or someone working on his behalf wasn't content to let things settle. They were testing him, waiting to see how far they could push before he snapped. Aaron wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The next day, Aaron decided to fortify his defenses even further. He had already reinforced the mailbox, but now he wanted to ensure he would know immediately if anyone tampered with it again. Drawing on his engineering background, he installed a motion-activated sensor system around the base of the mailbox. The system would send an alert to his phone and activate a loud alarm if it detected unusual movement. It wasn't just about catching Randall in the act, it was about sending a message that Aaron wasn't going to be an easy target. That night, the alarm went off. The loud, piercing sound shattered the stillness of the suburban street, jolting Aaron awake. He grabbed his jacket and phone, rushing outside just in time to see Randall's truck speeding away down the street. The motion sensor had done its job, but what caught Aaron's attention was the object left behind. A heavy crowbar lay on the ground near the mailbox, its surface scratched and dirty from use. It didn't take a detective to figure out what had happened. Randall, or someone he had sent, had tried to pry the mailbox loose and fled when the alarm activated. Aaron picked up the crowbar carefully, using a cloth to avoid smudging any potential fingerprints. It was a significant piece of evidence, and he added it to his growing collection. The next morning, he returned to the police station with the crowbar and a detailed account of what had happened. The officer who reviewed his case seemed more interested this time, especially given the escalation. "This is no longer just property damage," she said. "Leaving behind a weapon like this shows intent. We'll follow up with your neighbor." When the police visited Randall's home later that day, Aaron watched from his window as the older man stood on his porch, arms crossed and his face set in a defiant scowl. He could see the officers speaking to Randall, their gestures calm but firm. After a few minutes, the officers left, and Randall disappeared into his house without so much as a glance in Aaron's direction. The interaction was brief, but it sent a clear message: Randall was on notice. For a moment, Aaron felt a sense of relief. Perhaps this would be enough to make Randall back off, but that hope was short-lived. Later that evening, Aaron returned from running errands to find a pile of garbage bags dumped on his front lawn. The bags had been torn open, their contents spilling out to reveal food scraps, old newspapers, and other household waste. It wasn't subtle, it was a deliberate attempt to harass him. Furious, Aaron grabbed his phone to take pictures, documenting yet another act of vandalism. As Aaron cleaned up the mess, he realized he couldn't do this alone. The police were involved now, but he needed more support. That night, he reached out to a lawyer, explaining the situation in detail. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Claire Harding, listened carefully and didn't mince words. "You're dealing with a bully," she said. "People like him thrive on intimidation, but they crumble when confronted with legal consequences. We'll file a restraining order and document every incident moving forward. If he crosses the line again, we'll take him to court." With Claire's guidance, Aaron felt more prepared to handle the situation. Over the next few days, he continued to document everything: every glare from Randall, every time the truck idled outside his house, and every piece of garbage that mysteriously appeared on his lawn. He also began reaching out to other neighbors, subtly asking if they had ever experienced similar issues with Randall. To his surprise, several of them admitted to having problems with the older man. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Collins, recounted how Randall had once demanded she cut down a tree in her yard because it blocked his view. Another neighbor shared a story about Randall filing baseless noise complaints against their teenage son. These conversations revealed a pattern. Randall had been using intimidation tactics against the neighborhood for years, and most people had simply chosen to avoid confrontation. But Aaron wasn't like most people. He saw an opportunity not just to stand up for himself, but to challenge the status quo Randall had imposed on the street. If he could gather enough support from his neighbors, he could expose Randall's behavior for what it was: harassment disguised as authority. As Aaron prepared to take the next steps, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was building towards something bigger. Randall wasn't the type to back down quietly, and Aaron knew he needed to stay one step ahead. The reinforced mailbox, the motion sensors, the legal advice, all of it was just the beginning. Randall had turned this into a battle of wills, and Aaron was determined to win. Not just for himself, but for everyone on the street who had endured Randall's bullying for far too long. Aaron's efforts to fortify his defenses and gather evidence were paying off, but the battle with Randall was far from over. If anything, the older man's behavior grew more erratic after the police visit. For a few days there was an uneasy calm in the neighborhood. Randall seemed to be lying low, no longer glaring from his porch or idling his truck by Aaron's property, but Aaron knew better than to assume it was over. He'd dealt with enough stubborn personalities in his life to recognize when someone was regrouping for another attack. The calm ended one evening when Aaron came home to find a hand-drawn sign planted at the edge of his property. In large, bold letters, it read, "Dangerous structure, remove immediately." The sign was attached to a flimsy wooden stake, hastily hammered into the ground. Nearby, another pile of trash had been dumped, this time with the added insult of broken glass scattered across his driveway. Aaron sighed, taking photos of the scene before carefully removing the sign. It was obvious who was behind it, but Randall's cowardice in refusing to confront him directly only added to Aaron's frustration. That night, Aaron decided it was time to speak with his neighbors more openly. He had already learned from a few of them that Randall had a history of antagonizing people on the street, but now he needed to know if anyone had witnessed anything related to the latest incidents. He started with Mrs. Collins, the elderly woman who had shared her story about the tree. When Aaron knocked on her door, she greeted him warmly, offering him a cup of tea as they sat in her living room. "I saw someone out by your driveway last night," she said when Aaron mentioned the sign. "It was dark, but I recognized that truck of his. He was out there with a flashlight, fiddling with something. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I see what he was up to. That man has always been a troublemaker. I've lived here for 30 years. And he's been nothing but a nuisance to everyone." Mrs. Collins' account was helpful, but Aaron knew it wasn't enough to act on. He needed more witnesses, more voices to support his claims. Over the next few days, he knocked on more doors, gradually building a picture of Randall's behavior. Some neighbors were hesitant to get involved, not wanting to stir up trouble. Others were eager to share their grievances, recounting years of petty harassment and bullying. One neighbor, a younger man named Kyle, told Aaron about an incident where Randall had confronted him over the color of his house's front door. "He showed up one day with a paint sample and told me my door didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood," Kyle said, shaking his head. "I thought he was joking, but then he filed a complaint with the city. Luckily, it didn't go anywhere, but the guy's relentless when he wants something." As Aaron listened to these stories, he realized just how deep Randall's need for control went. The older man wasn't just targeting him, he had spent years trying to impose his will on everyone around him. The difference now was that Aaron wasn't willing to back down. He wasn't just fighting for his mailbox anymore, he was standing up to a man who had bullied an entire community into submission. With the support of several neighbors, Aaron decided to take action. He filed a formal complaint with the local municipality, outlining Randall's pattern of behavior and attaching statements from those willing to come forward. The complaint included detailed accounts of Randall's harassment, the vandalism of the mailbox, and the anonymous letter threatening Aaron to remove it. Aaron also submitted the evidence he had collected so far: photos, tire marks, and even the crowbar left behind during the failed attempt to destroy the mailbox. The municipality's response was slow, but they eventually sent an inspector to evaluate the situation. Aaron was home when the inspector arrived, a no-nonsense woman named Diane, who introduced herself with a firm handshake. She examined the mailbox, noting its reinforced design and the scratches from previous attacks. "This is clearly a sturdy structure," she said. "There's nothing unsafe about it. If anything, it's one of the most secure mailboxes I've seen." Aaron explained the history of the conflict, showing her the evidence he had gathered. Diane nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes in her clipboard. "It's clear there's more going on here than just a disagreement about a mailbox," she said. "We'll look into this further, but I'd recommend keeping track of anything else that happens. Documentation is your best friend in situations like this." That evening, Aaron felt a small sense of vindication. The inspector's visit wasn't a solution, but it was a step in the right direction. He hoped that the municipality's involvement would put additional pressure on Randall to back off. However, as the days passed with no further action, Aaron's optimism began to wane. He knew Randall wouldn't give up so easily. His suspicions were confirmed when, late one night, the motion sensor alarm went off again. This time, Aaron didn't rush outside immediately. Instead, he pulled up the live feed from his security cameras, which he had recently installed to cover the mailbox and surrounding area. On the screen, he saw Randall's truck parked a few feet away, its headlights off. A figure, Randall himself, was crouched by the mailbox, holding what looked like a wrench. Aaron's heart pounded as he watched Randall attempt to loosen the bolts securing the structure to its concrete base. Aaron quickly called the police, explaining the situation and emphasizing that Randall was caught in the act. "He's still out there," Aaron said, keeping his voice low. "Please send someone quickly." To his relief, the police arrived within minutes. Aaron watched from his window as two officers approached Randall, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Randall stood up, feigning surprise as though he had just been out for a stroll. The officers weren't buying it. After a brief exchange, they escorted Randall back to his house, warning him not to trespass on Aaron's property again. The next morning, Aaron filed for a restraining order with Claire's help. The evidence was mounting, and it was clear that Randall's actions were becoming more desperate. The restraining order was approved quickly, and Randall was officially forbidden from coming near Aaron's property or mailbox. It was a significant victory, but Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that Randall would find another way to retaliate. Sure enough, a few days later, Aaron woke up to find his garage door defaced with spray paint. The message was crude but clear: "Get out." Aaron sighed, snapping a photo before starting the cleanup. Randall's defiance was exhausting, but Aaron refused to let it deter him. If anything, it strengthened his resolve. Later that day, Aaron received a call from Diane, the inspector. "We've reviewed your complaint and the evidence you submitted," she said. "It's clear this individual has been engaging in sustained harassment. We're going to move forward with a formal investigation into his behavior." Aaron thanked her, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The municipality's involvement added weight to his case, and he was confident that Randall's reign of intimidation was nearing its end. As he hung up the phone, Aaron looked out at the mailbox standing strong at the end of his driveway. It wasn't just a structure anymore, it was a symbol of his refusal to be bullied, a testament to his resilience. Randall had pushed him to the brink, but Aaron wasn't just holding his ground, he was winning. The days following the restraining order brought a brief reprieve, but Aaron knew better than to assume the battle with Randall was over. If anything, the restraining order felt like a challenge to someone as combative and prideful as Randall. Aaron remained cautious, doubling down on documenting everything and keeping his defenses sharp. He installed additional cameras around his property, ensuring there were no blind spots. Every step he took now was calculated, not just to protect his property but to anticipate Randall's next move. The first sign of retaliation came subtly. One morning, as Aaron stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper, he noticed small shards of metal and glass scattered near his driveway. At first, he thought it might have been debris left by a passing car, but as he bent down to inspect it, he realized it had been deliberately placed right where his tires would roll. The sharp edges were unmistakable, intended to cause a flat. Aaron carefully cleaned up the mess, bagged the pieces, and added them to his growing collection of evidence. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder that Randall was still lurking, testing his patience and resolve. That evening, Aaron received a call from Diane, the municipal inspector who had reviewed his complaint. She informed him that the investigation into Randall's behavior was progressing, but there had been pushback. Randall had filed his own counter-complaint, accusing Aaron of creating a hazardous environment with his mailbox and claiming that the reinforced structure was causing issues for drivers. "We've seen this tactic before," Diane said with a sigh. "It's a classic move to try to shift the blame and create confusion. Don't worry, though. The evidence is heavily in your favor." Aaron appreciated Diane's reassurance, but the counter-complaint infuriated him. Randall wasn't just harassing him, he was actively trying to manipulate the system to turn the tables. It was a deliberate attempt to muddy the waters, and Aaron knew it was meant to wear him down. But rather than let it frustrate him, he refocused his energy on staying one step ahead. If Randall wanted to escalate the conflict, Aaron would be ready. A few nights later, Aaron was jolted awake by the sound of an engine revving loudly outside his house. He rushed to the window and saw Randall's truck idling at the edge of his property, its headlights off. Before Aaron could react, the truck sped forward, veering onto his lawn and leaving deep ruts in the grass before swerving back onto the street. Aaron stood there, stunned, as the truck disappeared down the road. It was an overt act of aggression, far beyond the petty vandalism of before. Randall wasn't just trying to intimidate him anymore, he was actively trying to damage his property in plain view. Aaron immediately called the police, explaining what had happened and emphasizing the danger of Randall's behavior. This time, the officers who arrived took the situation seriously. They examined the tire marks in the grass, reviewed footage from Aaron's security cameras, and confirmed that the truck belonged to Randall. One of the officers nodded grimly as he watched the recording. "This guy is escalating," he said. "We'll make sure he knows we're watching." The next day, Aaron received an update from Claire, his lawyer. She informed him that they had grounds to file a civil lawsuit against Randall for property damage and harassment. "This isn't just about the restraining order anymore," Claire said. "He's violating it, and that's enough to take this to court. If we press charges, he could face significant fines or worse, jail time." Aaron hesitated for a moment. Part of him wanted to avoid the stress of a prolonged legal battle, but he knew backing down now would only embolden Randall further. "Let's do it," he said firmly. "I'm done playing defense." As Claire began preparing the lawsuit, Aaron took additional precautions. He contacted a landscaping company to repair the damage to his lawn, making sure to document every step of the process for his case. He also reached out to a local security company, installing floodlights and motion detectors around the perimeter of his property. If Randall tried anything again, Aaron wanted to be ready. The next act of aggression came in the form of a strange package left on Aaron's doorstep. It was a small box, crudely wrapped in brown paper, with no return address. Aaron opened it cautiously, his stomach tightening as he pulled out the contents, a smashed replica of his mailbox, with the words "Know Your Place" scrawled across it in black marker. The message was clear: Randall was mocking him, trying to get under his skin. Aaron immediately photographed the package and called the police. An officer arrived to collect the evidence, nodding grimly as Aaron explained the situation. "This guy's getting bolder," the officer said. "You're doing the right thing by building your case." Despite the tension, Aaron refused to let Randall's antics dictate his life. He continued working on his home, maintaining his property, and building connections with supportive neighbors. To his surprise, several of them began reaching out, offering words of encouragement. "I heard about what Randall's been doing," Kyle said one afternoon as he stopped by to chat. "He's been a thorn in everyone's side for years. If you need backup, I'm happy to write a statement or testify." This growing support from the community was a turning point. Aaron realized he wasn't as alone as he had initially felt. Randall had spent years bullying and intimidating others, but now the neighborhood was starting to push back. With Claire's guidance, Aaron began gathering formal statements from his neighbors, building a comprehensive case that painted a clear picture of Randall's pattern of behavior. The more evidence he collected, the stronger his position became. But Randall wasn't done yet. Late one night, Aaron was reviewing documents when his motion sensors activated, flooding his yard with bright light. He checked the camera feed and saw two figures near the edge of his property, crouching by the mailbox. One of them was holding a can of spray paint, while the other appeared to be trying to loosen the bolts at the base of the structure. Aaron didn't hesitate. He called the police, keeping an eye on the feed as the two figures scrambled to finish their work and flee. The police arrived quickly, catching one of the vandals as he tried to escape. To Aaron's surprise, the young man wasn't Randall but someone much younger, a local teenager. Under questioning, the teenager admitted that Randall had paid him and a friend to damage the mailbox. The revelation was a bombshell. Not only did it confirm Randall's involvement, but it also added a new layer to the case. He was actively recruiting others to do his dirty work. Claire was thrilled with the development. "This is exactly what we needed," she said when Aaron told her the news. "It's no longer just your word against his. We have witnesses, evidence, and now testimony from someone he manipulated. Randall's not going to be able to wriggle out of this." As the lawsuit progressed, Aaron felt a renewed sense of determination. Randall had tried to break him, to make him feel powerless, but Aaron had turned the tables. With the support of his neighbors, the backing of the police, and the guidance of Claire, he was no longer just defending his property. He was standing up to years of unchecked bullying. Randall's reign of intimidation was crumbling, and Aaron was ready to see it through to the end. The lawsuit against Randall marked the tipping point in Aaron's long battle. Over the weeks that followed, the case gained momentum as Claire meticulously built their argument. The incident with the teenager who confessed to being paid by Randall was a significant turning point. It provided concrete proof of Randall's escalating behavior and his willingness to involve others in his schemes. Between the restraining order violations, the property damage, and the documented harassment, Randall's once untouchable position as the self-proclaimed enforcer of the neighborhood's standards was unraveling. When the court date finally arrived, Aaron felt a mix of anticipation and nervous energy. He'd spent months dealing with Randall's relentless provocations, and now it was time to bring everything into the open. The courtroom was a small, quiet space, but the tension inside was palpable. Randall sat at the defendant's table, his usually smug expression replaced by a scowl. His lawyer, a disheveled man who seemed unprepared for the mountain of evidence Claire had compiled, shuffled through papers with a look of growing concern. Aaron, by contrast, felt a surge of confidence as Claire laid out their case. She presented a comprehensive timeline of events, starting with the destruction of the first mailbox and leading up to the most recent incident with the hired vandals. Photos of tire marks, shattered headlight fragments, the anonymous letter, and the spray-painted replica mailbox were displayed for the court to see. The evidence was overwhelming, but what truly solidified their position were the testimonies. First, Mrs. Collins took the stand, her voice steady despite her age. She described witnessing Randall's truck parked by Aaron's property late at night, detailing his suspicious behavior with the flashlight. Her words painted a picture of a man who operated under the cover of darkness, hoping no one would notice. Next came Kyle, the younger neighbor, who testified about Randall's history of confrontations and baseless complaints. "He's been harassing people on this street for years," Kyle said firmly. "Aaron's just the first person who's actually stood up to him." But the most damning testimony came from the teenager who had been caught vandalizing the mailbox. With a mix of shame and defiance, he recounted how Randall had approached him and his friend, offering cash to send a message to Aaron. He said it wasn't a big deal, the teenager admitted. "Just mess up the mailbox a little, make it look like it wasn't worth the trouble." The judge listened intently, his expression growing more severe with each detail. When it was Randall's turn to speak, his defense was as weak as Aaron had expected. Randall tried to paint himself as a victim, claiming that Aaron's mailbox was an eyesore and a safety hazard, and that he had acted out of concern for the neighborhood. But under cross-examination, Claire dismantled his arguments with surgical precision. She pointed out that Randall had never filed a formal complaint with the municipality, nor had he attempted to address his concerns through legal or proper channels. Instead, he had resorted to intimidation, vandalism, and coercion. By the time Claire was finished, Randall's excuses had crumbled, and he sat hunched in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. The judge's ruling was swift and unequivocal. Randall was found guilty of multiple counts of harassment, property damage, and violating the restraining order. He was ordered to pay significant fines, compensate Aaron for the damages, and complete community service. Most importantly, the court issued a permanent injunction prohibiting Randall from coming within 100 yards of Aaron's property. Any further violations would result in jail time. As the verdict was read, Aaron felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Months of tension and conflict had culminated in a clear, decisive victory. Outside the courtroom, several neighbors who had attended the trial approached Aaron to offer their congratulations. "You did what none of us could," Mrs. Collins said, patting his arm. "Maybe now this street can finally have some peace." Kyle added, "You've set an example for all of us. Randall thought he was untouchable, but you proved him wrong." As Aaron drove home that evening, he couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed since he first moved into the neighborhood. What had started as a simple act of personal expression, a unique mailbox, had turned into a battle for his right to live peacefully. The mailbox itself had become a symbol of his resilience, a testament to his refusal to back down in the face of intimidation. Randall had underestimated him, thinking Aaron would fold like so many others. But Aaron's persistence, combined with the support of his community, had brought justice to a man who had bullied his way through life for far too long. When Aaron pulled into his driveway, the sight of his reinforced mailbox brought a small smile to his face. It stood tall and unscathed, a reminder of everything he had endured and overcome. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of true peace. The battle was over, and he had won not just for himself but for the entire neighborhood. The weeks following the court ruling brought a long-overdue sense of calm to Aaron's life. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, he felt like he could finally breathe. Randall, humiliated and burdened with fines and community service, kept a low profile. His truck, once a constant presence idling near Aaron's property, was no longer parked in plain sight. Neighbors whispered that he was considering selling his house and leaving the area altogether. Aaron couldn't deny the satisfaction he felt at the thought Randall had been the root of so much tension, not just for him but for the entire street. His departure would be a relief for everyone. In the days after the trial, Aaron turned his attention back to his home, eager to finish the projects he had put on hold during the conflict. He repaired the damage to his lawn from Randall's reckless truck stunt, planted new flower beds, and even repainted his front porch. It felt good to focus on something productive, to reclaim the peaceful life he had envisioned when he first moved in. The mailbox, of course, remained exactly as it was reinforced, sturdy and standing as a symbol of everything he had endured. Aaron considered making a few cosmetic updates to soften its appearance, but ultimately decided against it. It was perfect as it was a reminder that sometimes strength and resilience were more important than appearances. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. Neighbors who had once avoided confrontation with Randall now stopped by to chat with Aaron or wave as they passed. Mrs. Collins baked him a loaf of banana bread as a thank you, and Kyle invited him over for a barbecue, saying, "You're the reason this street feels normal again." Slowly but surely, Aaron felt himself becoming part of the community, something he hadn't expected when he first moved in. The isolation he had felt during the months of conflict faded, replaced by a growing sense of connection and camaraderie. One evening, as Aaron was watering his front yard, he noticed a moving truck pulling into Randall's driveway. The sight caught him off guard. Randall hadn't said a word to anyone about moving, but it seemed the rumors were true. Aaron watched as movers loaded furniture and boxes into the truck, while Randall stood off to the side, arms crossed and face tight with frustration. Their eyes met for a brief moment, but Randall quickly looked away, refusing to acknowledge him. Aaron didn't feel the need to say anything. Randall's departure was the final chapter in their conflict, a quiet resolution that didn't require words. As the moving truck pulled away, Aaron couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Randall's departure marked the end of an era of tension and hostility on the street. For Aaron, it was more than just the conclusion of a feud. It was proof that standing up for himself had been worth it. He had taken on someone who had spent years intimidating others and had emerged stronger, more confident, and with the respect of his neighbors. To celebrate, Aaron decided to host a small gathering for the street. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a casual evening with drinks and snacks in his backyard. He sent out handwritten invitations to every house on the block, and to his surprise, nearly everyone showed up. The atmosphere was warm and lively, with laughter and conversation filling the air. Mrs. Collins shared stories about the neighborhood's history, while Kyle manned the grill, flipping burgers and handing out beers. Even neighbors Aaron had barely spoken to before the conflict came by to thank him for standing his ground. As the sun set and the gathering began to wind down, Aaron found himself sitting by the fire pit, talking with a few neighbors about future plans for the street. They discussed organizing a community cleanup day, planting flowers along the sidewalks, and maybe even starting a small neighborhood watch group, not out of fear, but to ensure that the sense of unity they were building would last. For the first time, Aaron truly felt like he belonged. Later that night, as Aaron stood on his porch looking out at his property, he reflected on how much had changed. The mailbox stood proudly at the edge of the driveway, a quiet reminder of the struggle he had endured and the victory he had achieved. The battle with Randall had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, forcing him to confront not just his neighbor's aggression but his own limits and resilience. In the end, he had proven to himself and to the neighborhood that he wasn't someone who could be pushed around. Aaron smiled as he stepped back inside his house, closing the door on the conflict that had once consumed his life. His home was finally what it was meant to be, a place of peace, strength, and belonging.